the whole trend for double presenters came in at the time when those two started because they were doing it overseas. It's a trend thing. It's a saving money thing. And I think TVNZ, it's tough times at that ship. So I think this is all down to money. I don't think you can read too much more into it.
And I think TVNZ's got an obligation here. I mean, I've got a lot of time for Wendell. Of course I have a lot of time for Wendell. A lot of time for Wendy and for Simon. But at the moment, everyone's sort of going, this is terrible. We're going to have the white man line up on One News. Where's TVNZ coming in and justifying their decision? Instead of leaving their presenters hanging out there and having to either, social media. TVNZ need to front up and say, this is the decision, this is why we made it, and protect both of their staff.
We've got to jump to big news right now because I want to know if the Guinness World Record has been made for the world's biggest lamington. Kiwi social enterprise Cook's Night Off made the attempt. The lamington is, 2.5 tonnes. It's the equivalent to 50,000 regular lamingtons, and with us is Cook's Night Off Susan Cannell, who oversaw the venture. Susan, kia ora, welcome.
Good evening. How are you today?
I'm very well. Did this lamington break the world record or not?
It did. We're so excited. The previous world record was held by the Aussies, which was a little bonus, so we got to get one over on them. The previous record was just over 2,300 kilos, and our one, the final weigh-in, was 2,777 kilograms of lamington.
Congratulations, well done. So, what must have been a major enterprise getting the what?
Oh my goodness.
Where do you
what it looks like? What does it look like, please?
What is it? Wendell asked, what does it look like?
The cake was baked off-site in big slabs because obviously it's impossible to bake a single cake of that size. So we teamed up with Creative Edge Foods, wonderful bakery here in Auckland. They had one of their guys baking 48 hours, practically non-stop. They've used over 600 kilograms of flour, 500 kilograms of sugar, 13,000 eggs. I mean, the amount of ingredients is just mad. And then we held the event at Sylvia Park. All the cake was brought in slabs, and we just made it up layer by layer with coconuts and chocolate syrup in between until we had a big, giant lamington.
What was the flavour?
Chocolate. Quite right too, Wallace.
I understand that was quite controversial.
It was, and I really didn't expect it would be, but my goodness, people have very strong opinions about what flavour lamingtons should be. I didn't even know that was a thing, but it really is.
Well, good on you. Well done. And it all goes to a good cause?
It does, yes. After the lamington was finished, we chopped it up and it was donated to the Auckland City Mission, who are one of our charity partners. Because our company is a social enterprise, we do buy one, give one home-delivered meals. And we've just recently started, or this week in fact, offering our meals right throughout New Zealand instead of just Auckland. So this was a way of just letting everybody know about that. And absolute privilege to be working with the City Mission and to donate the lamington to the community food bank. So
where are you on this?
Driving around Auckland all day today.
Susan Cannell, thanks for joining us. Where am I on?
Are you chocolate or raspberry? Come on.
Raspberry all the way. Raspberry
so
all
wrong,
the way.
Wendell?
Wendell?
I'm chocolate.
Yeah.
All the way.
Yeah.
I'm with you, Sam. Yep.
Good to have you both on. Tax special tomorrow, 4:35pm. That was Mark Sainsbury, Wendell. Listen, I'm back tomorrow, 3:45. Till then, see you later.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere ake nei, yet another MP gets the sack, struggling to keep up. While this one was a Labour Minister, Ian Lees-Galloway is gone after admitting an inappropriate relationship with a former staffer. So was any public money used to sustain the affair? And at what point does your sex life dictate your fitness to be an MP? An Auckland man is sentenced to a year's home detention for selling millions of caged eggs as free range. Why were super wealthy friends of the Foreign Minister Winston Peters invited to go to Antarctica? And from midnight, masks are a must in Melbourne, with a record 484 new cases of COVID-19 in Victoria. Back here, managed isolation and quarantine is close to exhausted.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters has used parliamentary privilege to claim the leaking of his superannuation details was an ACT-inspired hit job. During general debate this afternoon, Mr Peters alleged former National Press Secretary Rachel Morton was the source of the leak. Mr Peters unsuccessfully sued former National Ministers Anne Tolley and Paula Bennett and senior public officials over the leak last year. He told the House that Ms Morton told ACT leader David Seymour, who passed the information on to a member of the Taxpayers Union. Mr Peters says this was then passed on to the father of National MP Chris Bishop, and then it was leaked to a reporter.
All it took was for that private information to fall into the hands of David Seymour, who craved media attention but couldn't claim the limelight because that would have placed the spotlight on Rachel Morton, his source. This is what dirty politics looks like.
Winston Peters, Ms Morton, says the allegation is categorically not true. ACT leader David Seymour says the claim he was involved in the leak is a baseless lie.
I categorically deny involvement in that leak. I had nothing to do with it, and I never will have had, didn't, nothing.
So Winston Peters is lying?
Winston Peters is a desperate man making it up, and in this case, telling lies.
David Seymour. The Prime Minister will direct officials to look into Ian Lees-Galloway's spending to ensure he did not misuse taxpayer funding as part of his affair. Jacinda Ardern has stripped the Palmerston North MP of his ministerial roles, saying he had opened himself up to accusations of improperly using his office. It's been revealed the Workplace Relations Minister had a 12-month affair with a former staffer who was working at one of his agencies. Jacinda Ardern says she will ask Ministerial Services to look into whether there was any misappropriation of funds.
I've asked explicit, detailed questions around this and have already been advised that that has not been the case, but no reason not to satisfy ourselves that that is true.
Jacinda Ardern. The official in charge of managed isolation and quarantine facilities is warning New Zealand has probably reached maximum capacity to accommodate those returning home. Air Commodore Darren Webb says there are now 32 facilities in 5 regions.
In the past 3 weeks, we've increased effective capacity by over a third. Nonetheless, based on the criteria for isolation facilities set by the Ministry of Health, we assess that we are now close to exhausting our nationwide available capacity.
Darren Webb says it's vital to keep some flexibility in the system to cope with unexpected events such as fog disrupting internal flights. Total capacity in isolation facilities is now just under 7,000 for a 2-week period. The government is introducing 2-week rolling quotas to stop more people arriving than can be accommodated. Taras, a small farming settlement south of Wanaka in central Otago, is being eyed up as a possible location for a new airport. Christchurch Airport is beginning discussions on the potential of building a new airport on 750 hectares of land there. Chief Executive Malcolm Johns says $45 million has been spent on the project so far. This includes purchasing the land bordered by State Highway 8 and 8A. The Foreign Minister has lashed out at media reports that he helped 2 wealthy Asian women get a taxpayer-funded trip to Antarctica, saying it's a racist attack on innocent people. Ben Ling Chu and her daughter Sue An Kwek were dual Malaysian New Zealand citizens, travelled to Scott Base in February after Antarctica New Zealand scrambled to make room for them. Mr Peters says the pair's trip was part of a fundraising drive to raise $50 million in public donations for the redevelopment of Scott Base. He says countless people, including overseas ambassadors and members of the European Union, have visited the frozen continent for the same reason. It's 4 minutes past 5. New Zealand Rugby is facing increasing criticism from its SANZAAR partners over plans to establish a new franchise competition, with legal action even being mooted by South Africa. The announcement last week of a planned 8 to 10 team competition based around the 5 New Zealand Super Rugby franchises dismantles the 25-year-old SANZAAR model. Sports editor Stephen Hewson reports.
New Zealand Rugby has sought expressions of interest from Australia to rent up to 4 teams, while its proposal also has provision for a Pacifica team. But Australian media reports suggest early Trans-Tasman talks have fallen flat, heightening the possibility of Rugby Australia establishing its own competition from next year. Rugby Australia has described negotiations with the NZR as expressions of insolence and says New Zealand is trying to dictate terms, while South African rugby boss Yuri Roux says New Zealand's essentially kicking itself out of Super Rugby and shunning binding SANZAR agreements. This is Stephen Hewson.
The Wellington Phoenix face a quick turnaround from Friday's first game back to A-League to tonight's game against the Perth Glory. The Phoenix are coming off a loss to Sydney, while Perth won their first game of the restarted competition. Meanwhile, Aston Villa's climbed out of the English Premier League's relegation zone with a match to play, beating Arsenal 1-0. The win moves them into 17th, one place ahead of Watford, who lost 4-0 to Manchester City. Villa and Watford have 34 points and Bournemouth are on 31, with two sides to be relegated. That's the news.
Stuck up a tree?
Only 2 of these sort of 50-odd trees are scheduled, which means they're protected, and therefore supporters are out here in the rain this morning, high up the trees. I can barely see them through the foliage, trying to save the others.
Stuck in the past?
The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered.
Stuck in the UK?
That plan costs are arbitrarily imposed upon us. We don't really have a choice sometimes to come back in New Zealand.
Get stuck on us. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Manawatu, including central high country. Showers and southwesterly gales in exposed places tonight from Waikato northwards. Bay of Plenty, showers clearing today, fine spells tomorrow and showers still possible then. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay mainly fine with scattered showers. Kapiti, Wellington and Wairarapa, isolated showers clearing, then mostly fine but a few showers again tomorrow afternoon. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury generally fine. Bulla and Westland, occasional rain or showers, snow to about 400 metres tomorrow. Otago, excluding Clutha, mainly fine but rain tonight, easing to isolated showers early tomorrow. Snow lowering to about 200 metres for a time. Fiordland, Southland and Clutha, showers turning to rain for a time tonight. Snow lowering to low levels overnight. Showers heavy and possibly thundery tomorrow with squally ones near the coast. Chatham Islands, rain turning to showers tonight. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. And this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. The political casualties just keep on coming. Today, it was Labour MP and Cabinet Minister Ian Lees-Galloway after admitting an affair with a former staffer. The Prime Minister says he's opened himself up to accusations of improperly using his position and has lacked the judgment expected of a minister. The information was passed to Jacinda Ardern yesterday afternoon at Parliament by the National Party leader Judith Collins. Just that morning, Ms Collins had been dealing with a resignation of her own, just the latest in a string of scandals for National. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
Just yesterday, National's Andrew Falloon resigned as an MP after sending an indecent image to a young woman. Today, it was Labour MP and Minister Ian Lees-Galloway.
This morning I am announcing that I have dismissed Minister Ian Lees-Galloway as a minister.
After receiving the information, Jacinda Ardern put the allegations to him last night, at which time he admitted to having a consensual relationship with a former staffer.
Over the course of the conversation with the minister, it became clear to me that his position as a minister was untenable. I advised him of that at that time.
The affair lasted about a year, and Ms Ardern says she understands it ended several months ago. In the end, she decided he'd shown a complete lack of judgment.
In undertaking this relationship, he has opened himself up to accusations of improperly using his office. He has not modelled the behaviour I expect as a minister that is in charge of setting a standard at culture as Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety.
Not only did Judith Collins pass the allegation on to Ms Ardern, but she spoke about it in media interviews this morning. She says she gave a straight answer to a straight question.
I wasn't going to obfuscate. That would have simply been a headline, and I had nothing to hide.
Ms Collins denies playing dirty politics.
In fact, what I've done is I alerted the Prime Minister to the information an hour after I received it. I refused to receive any detail from the informant, and I asked the informant to send it directly to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff.
The person who came forward was a third party and not the woman involved in the relationship. Ms Ardern says she was unaware it was being made public.
It was very clear to me that this was being done without their knowledge.
Ms Ardern was asked for her view on how Ms Collins had handled the information.
I received information. I passed it on to the Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition has received information and obviously has chosen to deal with that differently. That is her judgment. I made mine, she's made hers.
Ms Collins bridles at any suggestion she handled the Lees Galloway information in a worse way than Ms Ardern with the Falloon complaint last week. She says there's now an opportunity for her and the Prime Minister to work together.
As the leaders of the two major parties in Parliament, that we should together take a lead on this, and that we should sit down and work out what we believe MPs and also staff should have a safe working environment, how we can bring that about.
She says it's time to focus on the election and the things that matter to voters.
Most New Zealanders don't know who Andrew Falloon is, and hopefully will soon forget.
Mr Lees Galloway's ministerial colleagues responded to his resignation on their way into question time.
The thing with the slip-ups here is that the whole country gets to see them. If you're working anywhere else, it's not public knowledge. But we know that that's the environment that we work in, and so that's why our behaviour has to be beyond reproach.
Yeah, it was a bit of a shock, a bit sad, but I'll leave most of that kōrero for the Prime Minister.
Sad to see an end for any colleague, but I accept her judgment on the issues and think she's got it right.
Jacinda Ardern has asked ministerial services to investigate and make sure no taxpayer money was used inappropriately in the course of the relationship. In a statement, Ian Lees Galloway says he acted inappropriately and accepts the Prime Minister's decision. He's apologised to his family and anyone else hurt by his actions and says he won't be contesting the Palmerston North seat at the election. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
We did ask the Prime Minister on the programme this evening. She declined our invitation, as did Judith Collins, the leader of the National Party. We also invited the Labour Party President, Claire Szabo, on the programme, and she declined to be interviewed too, although she did release this statement. It says the Labour Party will move swiftly to select a new candidate in Palmerston North. Nominations are now open and we could choose a candidate as early as the weekend. If there is only one candidate, there will be a confirmation. In the event of a contested selection, the candidate will be chosen by a panel made up of local party members and representatives of the New Zealand Council. Early indications are there is a high level of interest. And that is a statement from Claire Szabo, who is the Labour Party President. Let's head overseas now, and the eastern states of Australia are on tenterhooks as Victoria recorded its highest daily number of infections since the start of the COVID-19 outbreak. There were a record 484 new cases overnight and 2 more deaths, bringing Victoria's death toll to 44, with the nationwide toll at 128. And despite the continual surge in cases, Premier Daniel Andrews has denied reports the state could enter into a New Zealand-style lockdown. Alex Perrottet has more.
Controls, Australians are trying novel ways to travel north. This man was found by police in a car boot on the Queensland border with New South Wales.
Oh, hello, buddy. Hello. Why are you trying to sneak across, mate?
The reason is pretty clear, with Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk boasting today of only 3 active cases of COVID-19 in the Sunshine State. But the picture isn't so perfect as that. Police are also hunting for 185 people who are missing from self-quarantine after giving the wrong contact information to police at the Queensland border. There's another 25 who weren't at their homes when police came knocking. But further south, the temperature is rising and state leaders are sounding rattled. Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales announced 16 new cases today and, concerned about the growing clusters, turned up the heat with her threats. New restrictions on gatherings and bookings at pubs, cafes and restaurants will come into force on Friday, and she wants flouters fined.
The state is on high alert. Please, we want everybody to think seriously about what they're doing over the weekend to make sure you avoid crowds. My conversations with the police commissioner and with the regulators is please make sure you throw the book at anybody not doing the right thing. Everybody's had ample notice.
And the Police Commissioner Mick Fuller is again battling protest groups in court over whether they can march next week in Sydney in a Black Lives Matter march.
You want your protest to be the one that puts New South Wales back 5 or 10 years economically, because that's exactly what could happen. It's exactly what we saw in Victoria. The message to my police out there is that we've given plenty of warnings. People fully understand the risks out there. The warnings are over. And if 1,000 people turn up, maybe I can only write tickets to 500. But do you want to be the first person to get the $1,000 ticket? That's the question.
Mick Fuller alluding to the cluster at the state housing towers in Victoria, some of whom were linked to a Black Lives Matter protest there. Now there's 205 Victorians in hospital, 40 of them in intensive care. The Premier of the Southern State, Daniel Andrews, was careful today with his tone, feeling the backlash from his own people for the blunder in letting that cluster fester with shonky security guards. The ABC reported this week that quarantine guards in Melbourne hotels were recruited via WhatsApp messages and told to bring their own masks. But there's no question that plenty of Victorians also have themselves to blame. Data released today shows that over the last 2 weeks, almost 90% of people infected still went to work and visited the shops after feeling unwell. And 53% of people who did get a test did not stay home before getting their results, despite the clear advice from health workers. But even that hasn't prompted Dan Andrews to consider a stricter lockdown.
We can't rule those measures out, but at this stage, the key factor here that's driving the numbers and driving our challenge is people that are sick but not getting tested. They ultimately do get tested, many of them, but in those intervening days, they are going about their business with symptoms at the height of their infectivity, giving it to others.
The Premier did threaten the current 6-week lockdown could go for much longer if the numbers don't come down, but he couldn't confirm if there were any penalties for people who don't follow the rules.
No one should be waiting for a test result at the supermarket or at their place of work or anywhere else other than their home.
But there's criticism that his hardship payment for people in insecure work doesn't reach people until they've tested positive, not when they're asked to stay at home awaiting the results. At the beginning of the month, there were 370 cases in Victoria. Now there are 3,408. And in the face of such numbers, health workers in Victoria are warning the other states to stay vigilant or face the same peril. For Checkpoint, Alex Perrottet.
Tony Blankley is an epidemiologist and public health specialist from the University of Melbourne, and he joins me now live. Good evening. Is this the peak of cases in Victoria, do you think?
Well, we hope so, but we can't guarantee it. They've just been steadily going up for about a week or so now. I like to think of it as what we've got is we've had 3 epidemics in succession. The first one was in the 12 postcodes that got locked down. The next one was in the rest of Melbourne that got locked down. And then the third one is amongst the essential workers or the people still out in the workplace. And you can't actually see them separately. So it's like we're on the top of a tabletop mountain and it's taken a while to get off it, to be honest. But the problem we see at the moment is that transmission amongst people out and about because they're Uber drivers or they're construction workers, and then add on to that what you just heard then, that people are not self-isolating when they're symptomatic or waiting for their test result, which is hugely problematic.
So, Tony, what is it going to take to get on top of this? Does the state actually need to move to a shutdown more similar to what New Zealand did?
All right, so what I've been saying over here for a week or so and getting traction is that you only do a hard lockdown for 2 reasons. The first one is to go for elimination, which myself and others have been advocating for strongly, but it's not the current official position. So that doesn't appear to be what we would do. The other reason to go for a hard lockdown is if our health services are under threat, that is the ICU capacity is going to get gobbled up. We're well short of that. There's probably about 2,500 cases per day before you'd be starting to get worried about that. So we're not going for a hard lockdown. It will probably be a smarter lockdown. So we're at about the equivalent of what New Zealand called level 3. We're shifting a bit towards what New Zealand did as level 4, but the extra things that we've got left is really shutting down the essential workers and also shutting down things like department stores. So Kiwis may be surprised to know that we've still got shoe shops open, Bunnings, all that sort of thing. The reason they're not closed is because we're trying to protect the economy at the same time, which is a devil of a situation.
So why aren't people taking this seriously enough as well? Because as we heard there, the Premier saying that a bunch of people are out wandering around with symptoms of sickness, if not COVID, still symptoms of sickness, waiting for a test result. Why aren't people taking this seriously enough?
I've got the same question. I can't answer it. But what I can tell you is that if you go outside at the moment, there's much more traffic than what there was in our first stage 3 lockdown. So we're in stage 3 lockdown again. There is certainly complacency out there. There are certainly more people who are considering themselves essential workers and moving around out there. As far as the people not being tested when they're symptomatic, I just can't explain that. Premier Andrews has been sort of lecturing us as though we're bad students over here of late. I've had some sympathy with him. It really does need to change. But we do have an extra trick up our sleeve, which is, as of tomorrow, mask wearing when you're out of the home, particularly in the supermarket or places you really do have to go inside, will be mandatory. And that should be quite effective at turning things around, particularly if there are essential workers, including those who should be at home, unfortunately, wear that mask. And when they go to the construction site, they just don't take the mask off when they get inside the gate, but they leave it on. That should really help turn things around, I hope.
So that's for 12 years old and above, I think it is, isn't it?
Correct. Yes.
But is there any penalty other than a telling off if you don't wear the mask?
There's a $200 spot fine. So it'll be interesting to see how that's rolled out. So, for example, I've just been for a bike ride and I didn't wear my mask. There will be some leniency around that. The key thing, though, if you think about it from a public health perspective, is wearing those masks when you're in an indoor environment, because outdoor spread's not that common. An indoor environment like a supermarket where you really are likely to be within 1.5 metres or even a little bit more than that contact. So that's what I hope people will be out doing enforcement. I'm also suspecting, I can't prove it, I'm suspecting that within a week from tomorrow, if you go to a supermarket in Melbourne without wearing a mask, you'll have people looking at you sideways. I think we'll go through quite a quick cultural change where there'll be a high expectation. At least that's my hope.
Do you fear that the state has lost the battle with this?
Yes. I must confess today I have been thinking, oh dear, because I've obviously been advocating for elimination. If we've got the virus here bedded into the community, that would suggest we've lost the race. However, on the other hand, South Korea got up to 800, I think it was, cases per day, managed to push it down really, really low again. We're at 500, nearly 500 cases a day. The UK has really brought it back around after a bit of a false start, and some of my colleagues are actually ex-Kiwis over there. Public health people are now trying to advocate for an elimination strategy in the UK. So it might take longer to turn it around, but yes, I am concerned about the complacency and the potential embedding of this virus in our community at this point.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is Professor Tony Blankley, who's an epidemiologist in Melbourne there, talking about the fact, well, they've had a record number of cases today, more than 480. It is 23 minutes after 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen for your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. Let us know what you think of the resignation, well, it was actually the sacking, wasn't it, of Ian Lees-Galloway as a minister. He has decided not to stand again at the next election. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Wealthy friends of the Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, were invited to go to Antarctica, partly in the hope they may donate private money to the redevelopment of Scott Base, the New Zealand First Leader says. The Deputy Prime Minister was reacting to revelations that two women closely linked to one of the richest families in Southeast Asia were granted prized spots to the ice on his direction. Emails show Antarctica New Zealand pushed back against the move, worrying it could derail Antarctic science. But Mr. Peters says he was actually trying to help the government agency raise money. But the Prime Minister won't say whether his behaviour was appropriate, and the women who took the trip say they were never asked for money. Guyon Espiter broke the story this morning and he filed this report.
Beilin Chu and her daughter, Suan Kwek, travelled at taxpayer expense to see the sights of the icy continent after being nominated by the Foreign Affairs Minister, Winston Peters. Beelin Chu says she's a good friend of Mr Peters and met him because of her family's business dealings with Mr Peters' old friend, the former National Party MP, Philip Burden. Antarctica, New Zealand scrambled to make the trip happen without disrupting the science program and was never told why Mr Peters nominated the pair. The government agency says it still doesn't know and is directing all questions to Winston Peters. Today he had an answer. He was hoping his friends might help contribute towards the $50 million of private money the government wants to help redevelop Scott Base.
That's what it's about. I've asked countless people from around the world to join this program, Swiss ambassador, other people as well. It's only part of that, and I despise this racist attack on innocent people, and I'm not going to give it the option of respectability.
Despite that, the pair have not been asked for money.
They have not given any money at this point in time. No one's asked for any money.
In fact, this isn't even a publicly known fundraising program at this point.
Well, we haven't even began this far to go public on that score.
Mr Peters acknowledges that the two women are friends of his and was asked today whether that was a factor.
Would they have been able to go on this trip if they weren't friends with you?
Look, I've had countless people and members of Parliament in their droves have been down there. And dare I say it, I've seen 14 journalists go on the trip. Could you please tell me what they did for Antarctica?
As for what the Foreign Minister has done, the Prime Minister isn't exactly endorsing his actions.
So do you think it's okay? Again, those questions should go to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I'm not involved with the deployment of individuals on those visits.
Jacinda Ardern won't even say whether she backs the idea of sending rich people to the ice in the hope that they will donate.
Again, this is something I've been advised of only retrospectively in the last few hours.
Deputy National Party leader Jerry Brownlee said he didn't accept the idea of the pair being possible contributors to the Scott Base redevelopment as being a valid reason for them to travel to Antarctica. He said if there was a campaign to get private money for Scott Base, then the government should be upfront about that.
You'd expect that to be a very, very widespread program that a lot of New Zealanders could consider putting money into, or people from overseas. But it must be transparent.
In Parliament, Mr Peters said dozens of people had been sent to Antarctica over the years, and Beelin Chu and Suan Kwek were being unfairly singled out.
This has all been done over the years, but not one of them has been the source or origin of a race attack.
National MPs seeing the irony in that, and the ACT leader David Seymour says the joke is on New Zealand first.
Winston Peters has just become a joke. That's taxpayer money for a good purpose, and he's just laughing at the New Zealand taxpayer. I think that's why he needs to be gone.
But Winston Peters is going on the way he knows best, with attack as the best line of defence. For Checkpoint, ko Guy and Espanatine.
An Auckland man has been sentenced to a year's home detention for selling millions of cage eggs as free range. The Commerce Commission opened an investigation in 2017 following a complaint from an employee. Chen Liu reports.
Xue Chen, also known as Frank, sold eggs through his company Goat Chick, a producer and supplier of free-range eggs from a farm in Henderson, West Auckland. Between 2015 to 2017, Chen's company bought more than 3 million caged eggs from other suppliers, packaged them in cartons labelled as free-range, and sold them at higher prices. The estimated profit was $320,000. Chen appeared in the Auckland District Court this week, where he was sentenced to a year's home detention, but said he will donate $50,000 to the SPCA. The chair of the Commerce Commission, Anna Rollins, says the penalty is appropriate.
This is a pretty serious case in that the claim that was being made that these eggs were free range just simply wasn't true, and for that reason we pursued this claim as a Crimes Act charge, and the penalty is consequently much more severe than would be available to us under the Fair Trading Act, and that reflects the severity of offending here.
Ms. Rollins says it's important consumers can rely on producers to provide truthful information.
Clearly this case reminds us that all businesses need to operate and advertise in a truthful way, but more generally they also need to make sure that claims are clear and they're accurate and they're not misleading. And in short, our message to businesses is if you can't back up what you have to say about your product, then don't say it at all.
The executive director of the Egg Producers Federation, Michael Brooks, says the case is disappointing. He says the Ministry for Primary Industries has improved its audit system in the last 3 years, and his organisation also introduced an independently audited tracing system.
We've encouraged our farmers to stamp their eggs, so put like 2 letters explaining what system, so FR for free range, for example. Each farm has a 3-digit number. We have a website called Trace My Egg. A customer can look at those 2 letters and the 3 numbers and find out which farm the egg came from.
Mr. Brooks says people can do their bit to avoid falsely labelled products.
We're certainly encouraging the supermarkets and other retail customers to only purchase stamped eggs because that gives them confidence. They don't want to be selling eggs that may have a problem. The rest of the industry doesn't want to be tainted by these behaviour of these people.
Jessica Chambers from animal rights organisation SAFE says such cases show there is no process in place to stop fraudulent behaviour.
There's no transparency or accountability in regards to egg labelling in New Zealand. It's impossible to visually tell the difference between cage and free-range eggs. So the consumer is relying on the honesty of egg producers and suppliers, some of which have made it clear that they cannot be trusted.
She doubts the egg stamping and tracing system works and wants the cage system banned.
It's a voluntary measure that can't actually stop egg suppliers from misleading the public.
The egg industry in New Zealand is phasing out conventional cages by the end of 2022, but Ms. Chambers says farmers will still be able to use colony cages, which she says don't give chickens enough space. The Commerce Commission has prosecuted 2 cases relating to free-range eggs in the past 10 years. Mō te horaka o te ahiahi nei kua chanleo tēnei.
Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, our Press Secretary of former Prime Minister David Lange says sexual activity is rife in Parliament and Ian Lees-Galloway is a victim of the current political climate. Christchurch Airport Limited announces plans for a new airport in Terrace, Central Otago. And options for managed isolation and quarantine facilities are close to being exhausted. There's a lot to talk about this evening, so if you've got something to say, do get in touch. If you'd like to share your views on Ian Lees-Galloway being sacked or Winston Peters guests to Antarctica, do get in touch. You can text us on 2101. Tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, and the email address that you can send us a message to is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time now for the headlines with Susanna.
New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters has used parliamentary privilege to claim the leaking of his superannuation details was an ACT-inspired hit job. The ACT leader David Seymour says the claim is a baseless lie. Details of Mr Peters' superannuation overpayment was leaked to media before the 2017 election. Others named by Mr Peters in Parliament today also denied similar accusations against them. Rachel Morton, a former National Press Secretary, says she had no part in the leak, and National MP Chris Bishop says allegations by Mr Peters against his father John Bishop are untrue. The National Party leader Judith Collins denies playing politics in revealing the affair of now-sacked Cabinet Minister Ian Lees-Galloway. Lees-Galloway will step down from Parliament at the election after admitting an affair with a former staff member. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the MP's actions left him open to accusations of improperly using his office and lacked good judgment. 7 people have been allowed to leave managed isolation early in the last week. The Minister in charge of managed isolation facilities, Megan Woods, says exemptions on compassionate grounds have restarted after being suspended when 2 women were allowed out early and later found to have COVID-19. Ms Woods says it's likely people will be allowed out for a few hours to visit dying relatives, but must then return to the isolation facility. Water is being lowered in a Bay of Plenty canal discovered to have a car submerged in it. The police were called to the Ruahine Canal near McLaren Falls Road in Ormanoa this afternoon. They say until they get access to the car, they won't know whether anyone was inside. State Highway 25 is closed at Whiritua on the Coromandel Peninsula as a fallen tree is blocking the road. Contractors are on site, but motorists are asked to delay travel in the area for now. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. It's time for the business news now with Nicholas Poynton. Tell me, Nicholas, so we've got the biggest fuel retailer. Who would that be?
Z Energy.
Okay, so they are saying that there's a sharp drop in sales over the first quarter. Do we know what that's down to and what's the plan for a bounce back?
Yeah, so Z Energy has reported a $15 million loss for the 3 months ending June. But this shouldn't really come as too much as a surprise because even before the pandemic, they were already battling declining sales and margins because of just a lot of competition in the retail fuel market. But as you'd expect, as we came into lockdown, sort of demand fell off a cliff. The only people who were really doing driving were people who were nipping out to the supermarket and back, and the handful of essential workers that are on the roads. But it also wasn't helped by the fact that there was also a global slump in oil prices. So all the oil, the excess oil that Z Energy just had sort of sitting around, they were selling back to the global market, to the world market, but at a loss. Despite this gloom, though, the company's CEO is pretty optimistic. He says they've already taken a number of steps to really get cash flow rolling. And one of these was recently they went to the share market and they raised $350 million. They're not going to pay a dividend, and they're also cutting back on capital expenditure at the moment. But they're also being helped by the fact that recently sales are up. It's been the school holidays, parents and households are out on the roads, so they'll be pretty happy about that. So they're expecting for the half year, they're expecting a profit, although it will be about half of what they made last year. And the markets, I'll just quickly get to how they responded to today's news. They liked it. Share price rose about 5% to $2.89 a share.
Okay,
so
interesting.
Pretty positive.
All right, we've got a survey that sort of shows that COVID-19 has done little to dent investor confidence. Whose survey is it, and why do they think that is?
So this is a survey, quite an interesting survey that came out from the Financial Markets Authority, and they were looking at how investors were feeling about COVID-19. And despite 60% of respondents reporting a loss or a decline in the value of their investments, about half about half saying that they were concerned about their financial situation, more than 70% were optimistic. They felt the pandemic was soon going to pass and the markets would recover. But I think it's quite important that we just acknowledge when this survey occurred. This was in early May, between the 5th and the 14th. So that's sort of level 3 territory. And so for the people who were surveyed, sort of the worst of the drop that we saw in the share market was already behind them, and they were already starting to see signs that the NZX was sort of rebounding at this stage. So I think that maybe explains a little bit of the optimism. There are also some other interesting little nuggets that came out of the survey. One was that people were becoming a lot more engaged and interested in seeking help with regard to their financial investments. They want to talk to people who know more about this. And the FMA says this is because people are psychologically, they're just a lot more interested in their losses than their gains. And a lot of people, as we ran into the pandemic, were anxiously checking their KiwiSavers, watching it sort of evaporate in front of their eyes. I wonder, were you one of those?
No, because I know that you should just probably ignore it for the moment because...
Sound advice.
It's up and down.
Yeah, well, look, I don't have much of a KiwiSaver to check, so I was like you, but maybe for different reasons. But the FMA says, like, for these people who are checking their KiwiSaver more, they wanted to get more advice to actually try and understand what's actually going on and what they should maybe do. Should they maybe switch from a growth fund, maybe look to one of these more conservative funds, or should they maybe look to invest elsewhere? So after speaking to the FMA today, I think this is maybe a positive sign that New Zealanders are maybe taking a small step to maybe improve their financial literacy.
Yeah, more engaged in their financial future at the very least. Okay, so you mentioned Z on the markets, but what else was happening there today?
So yeah, the NZX Top 50 is down 0.1%, so a slight change by down 14 points to 11,722. The New Zealand dollar is steady at 66.5 US cents, 93.1 Australian, and slightly up to 52.2 British pence.
Great. Thanks, Nicholas. That's our business news for the evening. Well, and in other big business news for Central Otago today, Christchurch International Airport Limited has purchased 750 hectares of land near Terrace with a long-term proposal to build an airport on the site. The site, around half an hour's drive from Wanaka, would provide another gateway to Central Otago and an alternative to Queenstown and Dunedin airports. Well, joining me now is Christchurch Airport Chief Executive Malcolm Johns. Good evening. Why Terrace?
Kia ora. Well, Terrace has always been the gateway to that part of the world, and when we looked around for optimal sites from both an aviation perspective and also proximity to multiple regions, Terrace came up as the number one site, and I guess that's why they call it Central Otago, because it's right in the middle.
So what's your vision?
Well, in essence, the conversation's been bubbling around for a couple of years around the availability of aviation infrastructure in the Lower South Island, and we're a long-term intergenerational airport here in the South Island. We've been around for 80 years. We thought that we could play a role in helping those communities, and the more we looked at it, the more we were interested in it. And for us, looking out over the next 50 years, there's no question that those communities are going to need more infrastructure, and we believe that we can play a positive role in that. But the most important thing is to start with talking to those communities before we so boldly assume that we know all the answers.
Yeah, so in that respect, have you had any opposition? Are you expecting resistance from your neighbours?
Look, I grew up in a town, small rural town, where a mining company came to town and proposed a mine, and what you got was a full spectrum of reaction from that community. But the most important thing that I learned through that process is you need to take the time to talk with that community, to understand what their social and economic aspirations are, because you're not just talking about the current generation, you're talking about the children and grandchildren to come. And 30 years on, that mine is still there supporting that town, and there's a really great symbiotic relationship there, and that's essentially the approach that we want to take with the good people of Terrace and all the regions that surround it. So have you started talking? Have you started talking to the people of Terrace already? Yeah. Well, obviously today's the first time that we've announced things publicly, and we'll take the coming months and years to have those conversations. And as we do that, we'll learn a lot, and hopefully we can explain a lot as well. And for us, we're really comfortable with those timeframes.
When do you want the airport to be up and running by?
When it's appropriate, and so obviously COVID-19 has had quite an impact on aviation demand and also tourism. We believe very, very firmly from our experience with the earthquakes that we will recover from COVID-19. We will return to a degree of new normality, and there will come a time in the future where the current airport infrastructure can't supply all that's needed, and that'll be the time for us to open this airport and to allow aircraft to use it.
So but I mean, how long is a piece of string? Are you talking about 4 years, 6 years, 10 years?
Look, if we have to sit on that land for 15 years, we'll be really comfortable with that. There's no pressing timeline to get it open in 5 years. In fact, that would actually potentially be quite negative for Queenstown Airport, and that's definitely not our intention. Our intention is to pick up the slack once Queenstown reaches its natural capacity, and we would envisage that sometime in the next decade that will occur. And so, if it's 5 years, it's 5 years. If it's 15 years, it's 15 years. But we certainly can't see it being longer than that.
Okay, so are you talking domestic or international flights here?
It'll be jet capable, so it'll be able to do trans-Tasman and domestic flights.
And when you say that you're not looking to usurp Queenstown, aren't you just trying to get a little bit of their business?
Well, the reality is that, best case scenario, you might open in 5 years, and, that may be the case, but Queenstown will fill up first. Queenstown is located next to Queenstown, and this airport is designed as an and. So there'll be Queenstown and this airport going forward. It's not an either or, and that's not, the conversation around that is not for us to necessarily get involved in, but we certainly see this as complementary rather than, a binary sort of outcome.
How much is this going to cost you?
Well, we've spent about $45 million so far, and most of that is land, obviously. We would imagine that, if you recreated an airport the size of Queenstown at the moment, that would probably cost you around $350 million. So, that gives you a feel for the starting point, and then you add inflation between now and when you build it.
So how many neighbours would you have immediately adjacent to you?
Well, I live about less than 1.5 kilometres off the runway here in Christchurch, and we would expect that within, a 2 or 3 kilometre radius, there would be substantially less than 100 neighbours.
But that's 100 neighbours you've got to talk around, isn't it?
Absolutely, no question. It's their community. We're not coming in with bulldozers tomorrow to start changing things. We've got to have those conversations, and these things evolve over many years. And as I said, it'll be somewhere between sort of 5 and 15, I'd imagine. And so absolutely, we need to listen to those people. We need to engage with those people, and there will be a range of opinions on that, and that is just fine by us.
Appreciate your time. That is Christchurch Airport Chief Executive Malcolm Johns there, talking about plans for this new airport near Terrace in central Otago. A staffer for former Prime Minister David Lange says in his time sexual activity was rife in Parliament, and Ian Lees-Galloway is a victim of the current political climate. Lees-Galloway's affair with a former staffer drew instant comparisons to Lange's extramarital affair with his speechwriter Margaret Pope, whom he eventually married. But Lange's former press secretary Ross Vintner says the two flings are different. Nick Trubridge has the story.
The experience of Parliament is that in my time it was a little hub of sexual activity.
Parliament, a hub of sexual activity. That's from former Press Secretary Ross Vintner. His former boss, the late David Lange, himself had an affair in office with his speechwriter, Margaret Pope, whom he later married. Vintner says Ian Lees-Galloway's behaviour, a 12-month romance with his former staffer, is standard in Wellington.
I have known over the years ministers and MPs who've had affairs who have not had to resign. When I first went into Parliament and then the Beehive, I mean, there was always issues of affairs and things, and I think that has never ceased.
So then, is it fair that Lees-Galloway has been sacked for an extramarital affair? The relationship was consensual after all, but Vintner puts Lees-Galloway's dismissal down to one thing: a sleazy political environment in the run-up to a highly charged election. He says Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern had little choice but to cut Lees-Galloway loose.
To act in another way would really raise a number of questions which are just, quite frankly, not acceptable or tenable at this particular time. We're too close. We're too close out, and we're in obviously the season of sordid politics.
Online, commentary has been quick to compare Lees-Galloway's actions to those of David Lange's. But Vintner says there are some obvious differences.
They declared the relationship, which was mutual between them, as between David Lange and Margaret Pope, and that was all up and out in the public, and it was revealed also by Naomi Lange as well.
He also says times have changed.
People are a lot more, or should be a lot more careful about their private lives now, because the risk of exposure, which wasn't so obvious back in the 80s, is now very real and very apparent.
Charlotte Parkhill, a partner in Denton's Kensington Swans employment team, says while workplace relationships are common, Lees-Galloway's fling with the staffer is problematic given his workplace relations portfolio.
You can't fire people for having an affair, but if it brings the company, or in this case the party, into disrepute, then that might change matters. So I think it is really about the portfolio that he holds that has impacted on the Prime Minister's view of his conduct.
Parkhill says Lees-Galloway's actions may also raise the issue of an MP abusing their sway as a government minister.
The other point that employers are always very concerned about is where there is an imbalance of power, so where it is somebody who is perhaps very senior in the organisation, and the perception, again, it could be a disrepute issue, or it could be even within the wider organisation if it isn't something in the public domain. The perception that somebody is abusing the senior nature of their role in order to obtain that relationship.
Meanwhile, Checkpoint took to the streets of Wellington to ask the question on everyone's mind. Is having an affair a sackable offence for a government minister?
Not really, no. No, I don't really. But if you're in an office, yeah, I don't. But when you're in a politician, maybe I do. That's all, you know. Because they hold so much high power. I just think he's in a power of position, and we're governed by these people. And they set the rules, and it sort of seems, it's not really fair that a person like him does that, and when he's governing a lot of us,
I was a little bit surprised that he was sacked for it, but I don't know the detail. So I wasn't surprised about Andrew, that's right. I did think his was, but I don't really know anything apart from what I've seen on my Google this morning. So we probably expect a little much of politicians, and I do believe they're under huge stress and probably slightly vulnerable, more vulnerable than others because of it. They are the leaders, and whether we like it or not, politicians and top sports people have become the sort of people we look to, and their behaviour has an impact on how younger people see what's appropriate, I think.
I think what has happened is the correct procedure to follow. He has to go. Code of conduct that they work under, or supposed to be working under, has obviously been breached. He's used his power in some not appropriate manner, and and he's a top politician.
So opinions are split amongst the voting public. That doesn't matter for Lise Galloway though. He won't be receiving any ticks come September 19, with an affair costing the Palmerston North MP his political career. For Checkpoint, Nick Trowbridge.
It's 10 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. A lot of you getting in touch about this, the sacking of Ian Lise Galloway. Lewis says, I feel sorry for Ian Lise Galloway. Sad that people have to face judgment by the public like this, and a sad way to end your career. Another person says, surely consensual sexual relationships between two adults who are not married to each other is their business and not the public's. The only reason Jacinda had to sack this minister for having an affair was because his portfolios included Minister for Workplace Safety. Jacinda did the right thing. Judith did the wrong thing to bring it to the media. She did it to try and convince the public that Labour's members of Parliament are no better than Nationals. This from another listener, though, who says Judith Collins was asked outright on TV if she had passed any information on Labour MPs and answered as she had to, yes, and was discreet. If she had said no, she would have been castigated for not telling the truth and withholding information, as Muller and others were. For goodness sake, Jacinda and others saying she is playing dirty politics, she isn't. Judith has done a fantastic job in such a short space of time with skill and competence like we haven't seen from any MP for some time. A real breath of fresh air. And this one from another listener, I don't think Judith even knows her brand of politics is dirty. It appears to be business as usual to her. No coincidence her dirty politics hitman Cameron Slater has surfaced after a long illness and court cases. If you want to get in touch about anything you've heard on the programme this evening, including the sacking of the minister, you can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or the email address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Options for managed isolation and quarantine facilities are close to being exhausted. At a media conference this afternoon, it was revealed the government is introducing a quota system for passenger flights and aims to ensure isolation facilities are not swamped by too many New Zealanders arriving home. Philippa Tolley reports.
The head of Managed Isolation and Quarantine, Air Commodore Darren Webb, says New Zealand has probably reached maximum capacity to accommodate New Zealanders arriving back. That is just under 7,000 for a 2-week period.
Our current capacity is provided by 32 Managed Isolation and Quarantine facilities across 5 regions. In the past 3 weeks, we've increased effective capacity by over a third. Nonetheless, based on the criteria for isolation facilities set by the Ministry of Health, we assess that we are now close to exhausting our nationwide available capacity.
The Minister in charge of Managed Isolation Facilities, Megan Wood, says the Ministry of Transport is working with airlines to amend their licences to allow rolling 2-week quotas.
This measure will provide an important additional defence against COVID-19 by ensuring the demand on our managed isolation and quarantine facilities from those returning does not exceed the safe levels of capacity that we have established.
Ms Woods says demand and supply must work in lockstep.
It was very much a demand-driven system and supply was having to chase to catch up with that. What we want to ensure is that we have a very clear idea of what our safe isolation facilities are, and that we're matching demand to that supply, because we've got to ensure that we are keeping New Zealanders safe.
The government has now decided against setting up isolation facilities in Dunedin as there were no sites that fulfilled safety and logistical requirements. Invercargill and Queenstown have already been ruled out. Mr Webb says it's necessary to leave some slack in the system.
It's not possible to predict with absolute certainty exactly who's going to come into New Zealand. We've seen the volatility in the system to date. And in addition, we need to ensure that, say we have another fire alarm that goes off and we have to evacuate a full hotel, fog situations. So anything like that, we need to have an ability to hold some overflow, and that just seems to make sense to us.
Ms Wood says, however, New Zealanders need not fear they won't be able to return home because there's still capacity for 14,000 to return every month.
Put that into context, that we've so far, since 26th of March, had 30,475. So we're saying each month we'd be able to accommodate nearly half of that again. This is a large number of New Zealanders who will be able to safely return home while we simultaneously maintain that strong line of defence for New Zealand, protecting our health and the gains that we have made.
Exemptions on compassionate grounds, which were suspended after 2 women later found to have COVID were allowed out early, have now restarted, with 7 granted in the last week. Ms Wood says criteria are very strict.
There is a threshold that has to be met, and that is about recognising where there are a handful of individuals that do have very exceptional circumstances that for some reason or another may need to be released before the 14 days.
Ms Wood says no final decision has been made on whether to charge people who are returning for their stay in isolation facilities. Meanwhile, there are no new cases of COVID-19 to report in New Zealand, which makes it 82 days since the last infection in the community from an unknown source. For Checkpoint, Philippa Tolley.
Doctors say there were fewer babies born prematurely in New Zealand's lockdown, following a trend also seen overseas. They say understanding what's behind the change could help save some babies from a lifetime of complications. Here's our health correspondent, Rowan Quinn.
Auckland obstetrician and gynaecologist Michelle Wise says she and her colleagues noticed a definite change during the lockdown.
As obstetricians, we were seeing fewer women being admitted in preterm labour, and we similarly felt that the nurseries were less busy with babies having been born early during the lockdown.
Dr Wise says the evidence so far is anecdotal and national data won't be available until the end of the year. But doctors in Ireland and Denmark have already been crunching the hard numbers, and their findings have made specialists around the world take note. They separately published studies about huge drop-offs in the number of premature births during their lockdowns. The effect was strongest for very premature babies, with the number born before 28 weeks gestation dropping up to 90%. Dr Wise says arriving that early can have a huge impact.
After the baby is born, there's less opportunity for holding baby, for that initial bonding, for breastfeeding. These babies need a lot of extra care, so they're being looked after 24/7 by the nurses in the neonatal unit, with tubes coming out, possibly needing help to breathe, needing to be kept warm, needing to keep their sugars up.
About 7 or 8% of New Zealand babies are born before 37 weeks. Dr Wise says the overseas studies, and others that will undoubtedly follow, could provide vital breakthroughs in preventing preterm birth. There are already theories about why lockdowns might make a difference, such as women doing less physically demanding work, less shift work, or perhaps improved air quality. But avoiding illness could also play a part.
We saw across all the hospitals a reduction in people being admitted for all kinds of different infections during lockdown, because there was a lot less transmission of all infectious diseases. And we know that there's an infectious or an inflammatory process involved with having your water break early or going into labour early.
Midwife Claire MacDonald says her colleagues didn't notice a big change, but any trend is more likely to be picked up by hospital neonatal wards. But they did see other benefits for babies in the lockdown.
A lot of midwives are talking about babies who are gaining a lot more weight than they normally see in those early weeks after being born. I think the main reason that's been suggested for that observation is that new mothers just had to stay at home and there weren't so many distractions, so they might just have spent more time sitting with their babies and breastfeeding them.
She says she wants to see more research because if proven, it could hold valuable keys to preventing early births. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi ko Rowan Quinn tēnei.
Some more of your feedback before the news at 6. Joanna has got in touch to say real stomach churning. Families used as collateral in the game of politics could have been sorted out of the light of the media and public. If this is Collins's first week, what next? Shame on them all. Someone else says, I think it's unfair to dismiss productive ministers for being human and expressing their sexuality. I think warnings are more fair. The workplace is a social place. Trying to stop natural attraction is insensitive and inhumane. Another listener says classic dirty politics by Judith Collins, leaking the Ian Lees-Galloway story on public media this morning. The PM handled it perfectly. Collins needs to watch and learn. Her behaviour is disgusting, this listener says. And this one, Boris Johnson would not last long in the New Zealand Parliament. Thanks for your feedback. Do keep it coming.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leatawa tēnei. There have been blanket denials from all of those alleged to have had a hand in the leaking of Winston Peters' superannuation details. The New Zealand First leader used parliamentary privilege to point the finger at those he claims leaked information to media. Here's political reporter Yvette McCullough.
Mr Peters told the House former National Party Press Secretary Rachel Morton told ACT leader David Seymour about his superannuation overpayment. He claims Mr Seymour then told the Taxpayers Union's Jordan Williams, who passed it on to John Bishop, the father of National MP Chris Bishop, and to right-wing blogger David Farrar. Ms Morton says the claims are categorically untrue, while Mr Seymour says Mr Peters is telling sleazy lies. Chris Bishop dismissed them as a fabrication, while Mr Williams described them as pure fantasy and Mr Farrar as insane. From Parliament, Yvette McCullough.
The opposition leader Judith Collins denies playing politics over the affair of sacked Cabinet Minister Ian Lees-Galloway. He's admitted to an affair with a former staffer. The Prime Minister says he's opened himself up to accusations of improperly using his position as Minister. An initial allegation was passed to Jacinda Ardern yesterday by Ms Collins. She denies any dirty politics, saying it was handed over in good faith. Meanwhile, locals in Mr Lees-Galloway's Palmerston North electorate say they feel let down.
Shocked and then disappointed, and sad actually, because we knew him as a good guy, but we just did not expect this from him.
He should know better than that, to do that, and I think it's really unprofessional. I reckon Jacinda Ardern done the right thing.
People on the streets of Palmerston North. The Foreign Minister has lashed out at media reports he helped two wealthy Asian women get a taxpayer-funded trip to Antarctica, saying it's a racist attack on innocent people. Dual Malaysian-New Zealand citizens Ben Bile Chu and Su An Kwek travelled to Scott Base in February after Antarctica New Zealand scrambled to make room for them. Mr Peters says the pair's trip was part of a fundraising drive to raise $50 million for the redevelopment of Scott Base. He says countless people, including ambassadors, have visited the frozen continent for the same reason.
I despise, again, this appalling racist attack on two people who could be helping in the program based on an attack for the 18th time, the 20th time, out of a taxpayer-owned operation called Radio New Zealand.
Winston Peters says the pair haven't given any money and the fundraising effort isn't public yet. 7 people have been allowed to leave isolation early in the last week. The Minister in charge of managed isolation facilities, Megan Woods, says exemptions on compassionate grounds have restarted after being suspended when 2 women were allowed out early and later found to have COVID.
There is a threshold that has to be met, and that is about recognising where there are a handful of individuals that do have very exceptional circumstances that for some reason or another may need to be released before the 14 days.
Megan Woods says it's likely that people will be allowed out for a few hours to visit dying relatives, but then return to the isolation facility. Authorities do not yet know how many people have had to move out of their homes in Northland due to flooding. EQC has so far received 117 land claims for the Northland flood, but this does not record displacement. Amy Williams reports.
Northland residents affected by flooding after the weekend's rainstorm have been toughing it out with more heavy rain and wind gusts today. Some have sought temporary accommodation, but it'll be 6 weeks before figures on insurance claims are released. Civil Defence has made contact with residents in remote and difficult-to-reach districts cut off by the flooding, after earlier efforts were hampered by slips blocking roads. Many residents in Moroa, one of the towns worst hit by the flooding, will have their wastewater restored by the end of tomorrow. Ko Amy Williams, TNA.
It's coming up to 4.5 minutes past 6. The Black Cap skipper Kane Williamson is playing down any perceived strain in his relationship with coach Gary Stead. Williamson is currently at a training camp in Mount Maunganui as the side begins preparations for a busy international summer. The pair are known to have philosophical differences at times, and in recent months it led to a speculation that Stead is keen to replace Williamson as skipper and bring in Tom Latham. But Williamson says his relationship with Stead is both honest and challenging.
Gary and I have a very good relationship. We're always honest with each other and keen to challenge each other with our perhaps views on the game, and ultimately we both share the vision of where we want the team to go, and that's a really positive one. How we get there is a constant discussion, like in any organisation.
Kane Williamson. New Zealand Rugby has been accused of trying to drive a wedge between Australia's professional sides and the country's National Rugby Union. New South Wales Waratahs chair Roger Davis has told the Sydney Morning Herald that New Zealand's rugby has approached Australia's Super Rugby teams directly to join its proposed 2021 competition, rather than going through the national body Rugby Australia. The NZR wants to revamp the Super Rugby competition, reducing it by 8 to 10 teams, meaning a likely reduction in the number of Australian sides. Rugby Australia wants its 4 teams plus the Western Force involved. Davis says New Zealand's approach is appalling, and dumping 2 or 3 Australian sides would do irreparable damage to the game there. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
The library is also a huge social resource. It's a place where you can go when you have no money, and before it closed, it was a hugely important place for the city's homeless.
Lately, with me, Robert Kelly, in for Karen Hay.
It's much more enjoyable than a man-made ice because it's harder and faster, and trampolines because it's sitting on water as opposed to a ring.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately, with me, Robert Kelly, in for Karen Hay, every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Manawatu, including the central high country. Showers and southwesterly gales in exposed places tonight from Waikato northwards. Bay of Plenty, showers clearing today, fine spells tomorrow, and then showers are possible again in the afternoon. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay mainly fine with scattered showers. Kapiti, Wellington and Wairarapa, isolated showers clearing then mostly fine, but a few showers again tomorrow afternoon. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury, generally fine. Bulla and Westland, occasional rain or showers, snow to about 400 metres tomorrow. Otago, excluding Clutha, mainly fine, but rain tonight, easing to isolated showers early tomorrow. Snow lowering to about 200 metres for a time. Fiordland, Southland and Clutha, showers turning to rain for a time tonight. Snow lowering to low levels overnight. Showers heavy, possibly thundery tomorrow, with squally winds near the coast. Chatham Islands, rain turning to showers tonight. RNZ National, it's 7.5 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome back to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. In an explosive display in Parliament this afternoon, Winston Peters has named the people he believes are behind the leak of his superannuation details, describing it as a hit job inspired by the ACT Party. The New Zealand First Leader and Deputy Prime Minister refused to repeat his accusations outside the debating chamber. But inside the House, under the protection of parliamentary privilege, he listed those he believed were responsible. Mr Peters told the House that the former National Party Press Secretary, Rachel Morton, was the original source of the leak, having heard the ministers Anne Tolley and Paula Bennett discussing the case. He told Parliament Ms Morton then told the ACT leader David Seymour, who told the Taxpayers Union founder Jordan Williams, who told the pollster David Farrer, and John Bishop, the father of National MP Chris Bishop.
But it was an ACT-inspired hit job to damage me politically in collaboration with a senior National Party staffer, Rachel Morton, who was the source of the leak and the source that led to Jordan Williams weaponising the information during the election campaign. Every last one of them, Morton, Seymour, Williams, Bishop, Murphy, Farrar, played dirty politics to breach my inalienable right and the inalienable right of every New Zealander to privacy.
The claims have been met with blanket denials from those named. Rachel Morton tweeted, "The claims made by Winston Peters about me today are categorically not true." David Farrar has described the allegations as insane and says he did not know a thing until the story was published back in 2017. In a tweet, Jordan Williams said Mr Peters was delusional. And David Seymour told Parliament the claims were disgraceful, sleazy and categorically false.
I want to tell the House none of that happened, and the fact that Winston Peters is prepared to say it using the privilege of this House, but he's not prepared to say it out there where if he says it he'll be helping me finally get that home deposit. He's not prepared to say it at all. And unfortunately, this is the kind of sleazy, base behaviour that people up and down New Zealand have got used to from Winston Peters and New Zealand First.
National MP Chris Bishop also leapt to his feet in Parliament to hit back at the accusations.
We all know why it's happened. It's because of the Antarctica New Zealand story that broke this morning on Radio New Zealand. It's clear as day. 40 years he's been doing this, and he will continue to do it for as long as he's in this Parliament. And I, for one, hope that the good voters of New Zealand follow the voters of Tauranga and the voters of Northland at the 2017 election, and Hanua all the way before that, as Mr McIndoe reminds me, and cast him into political irrelevance. That's what we hope they do.
That was National MP Chris Bishop. It's not just about the affair, it's about the lies and power imbalance, and Ian Lees-Galloway had to go. That's according to former National Party MP Chester Borrows. The Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, Immigration and ACC was sacked after admitting an extramarital affair with someone who worked in one of the departments he headed. Jacinda Ardern said he'd lost her confidence and he'd opened himself up to accusations of improperly using his office, and his position as a minister was untenable. The revelations came to light after a third party, not the woman involved in the affair, emailed National leader Judith Collins about the allegations. A former minister in the National government, Chester Borrows, says it's hard to trust a minister who's been caught out lying.
The Prime Minister's made it clear that it's not just the fact that he was having an affair, but obviously the position he held was workplace relations and health and safety and those sorts of things, and actually inter-office relationships, power and equities in relationships has been in the news for the last few years. Think of the law firms, the Defence Force, those sorts of things.
In your view, did he have to go as a minister?
It is a question of integrity for a minister, and the public will be thinking, well, if he's prepared to lie to his wife, he'll lie to us. So it is about the integrity of the Cabinet, and that's what obviously Prime Minister Ardern was thinking of.
She spoke a lot about the fact that this woman was connected to an agency that was associated with his workplace portfolio. So I suppose that begs the question, would it have made any difference if he was having an affair with someone who was associated with his ACC portfolio or immigration? Or is it just that he's a minister and he's having an extramarital affair with a worker?
I think the power imbalance is the biggest thing. I don't think the portfolio is necessarily as important as that, although the specifics around the health and safety and workplace relations ministerial portfolio is significant in this case.
How does it compromise him as a minister?
It compromises him in terms of his integrity, in that it is an affair that's going on alongside being in a married relationship. Now, people will say that's a moral question, but when it comes to whether you can trust what people say or what they do, it's inconsistent with somebody who is supposed to be able to be held to account and told the truth to the public.
Chester, does this not raise an enormous dilemma then? Because if it's one of telling the truth, I mean, how many other MPs in Parliament are lying about extramarital affairs? And should they be under scrutiny?
Well, they are under scrutiny, obviously, and that's the whole issue you've got here. In that, you think about recruiting future members of Parliament or candidates to stand in seats, and now there are a number of seats where there's going to be a rushed recruiting and selection process. And when you have that rush, then you tend to get lower calibre candidates. So, the fact is really that anyone thinking about being an MP better be very careful that the terms in which they broke up with their girlfriends going back better have been good and not going to come out and bite them, because all of a sudden they're vulnerable to that. Anyone who's had some stray one-night stand after an office party and then seeks to go to Parliament, be an MP, and then gains profile as a minister is vulnerable to attack. And this could come back and bite them years after the event, and not necessarily from the person they had the liaison with, but other people who knew.
Is that fair scrutiny, though, Chester?
Well, I don't know how much of us could bear a real intense level of scrutiny around everything we do in our private lives. Nevertheless, that's where we've got to, and it's what people will take into account. And then you end up with the people who have been thinking about going to Parliament for a very long time, made preparations around being in the best place to do that, and been thinking when they've, been on a night out on the terps or the tiles, that actually I do have this ambition down the track and I've got to be really careful, I best go home now, is they're the people who don't tend to stuff up down the track when they get to Parliament. And a lot of people who go to Parliament have never lived under this level of scrutiny.
So you've been in Parliament. How common are affairs in this environment?
Well, actually, to be honest, I didn't, and I better be after all what I've just been saying, I didn't find that there was a large number of these affairs going on in Parliament, or as many as I thought there would be, bearing in mind that nowadays MPs are a hell of a lot busier than they ever were. They're expected to cram a lot more into a week than previously, because in the past, under the old regime, MPs were away for home for longer, Parliament sat more hours, but nowadays MPs are expected to work right through until 10, not just in the chamber but in their offices preparing for other meetings, and actually holding meetings right up till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. So I think that the opportunities are less. There's certainly a lot less drinking going on than there used to be back in the day from all reports, and you can see that in the amenities that are around Parliament and the way that they're frequented. So I think it's less than there was back in the day, but it's still, it occurs. And it's, I guess, Lisa, it's not surprising. You've got a whole lot of sort of type A competitive people who are conscious of image and the rest of it. And so they, these things tend to come out in those sorts of circumstances. If you look at other areas of employment where you've got high levels of competition, testosterone type A people, then there tends to be these sorts of goings on.
Chester, assuming a sexual relationship is a consensual one, when should, that part of your private life, your sex life, determine whether you are fit to be an MP or not?
Well, I think there is an issue when people are maintaining multiple relationships at the same time, because invariably it involves deceit. Now, the public apply that level of deceit to the portfolios that people are carrying on their behalf as ministers of the Crown. So there'd be a major inconsistency of a minister of the Crown carrying on multiple relationships and that involve deceit, for instance, to a partner, and then say that when they're standing in front of the microphone and representing the public of New Zealand as a minister of the Crown, that there's no deceit. And I've seen situations where people have gone into Parliament where they're not used to ever having to consult anybody at all about their behaviour or anything else, and then they end up falling foul of the whips, they fall foul of their colleagues, they let people down and all the rest of it. If that's the way they conduct their life before they go to Parliament, that's the way they'll do it when you're in Parliament, and that's when they'll get into trouble.
And that's former National MP and Minister Chester Borrows. So what do people in the Palmerston North electorate think about their soon-to-be former MP and what's come to light today? Here's our reporter Charlotte Cook with cameraman Dom Thomas.
I'm in Palmerston North, where Labour Minister Ian Lees-Galloway has held the seat for 12 years. But this morning it was revealed the Workplace Relations Minister had a relationship the Prime Minister said showed a lack of judgment. Ian Lees-Galloway has publicly apologised to his family for letting them down and was at home with them today in Palmerston North. But when I visited, no one was answering. It was much the same story here at his electorate office. His campaign manager, who is also a local councillor, refused to comment. So how are the people of Palmerston North feeling about the news?
Shocked and then disappointed, and sad actually, because we knew him as a good guy, but we just did not expect this from him.
He should know better than that to do that, and I think it's really unprofessional, and I think for the reputation of the political party, I reckon Jacinda Ardern done the right thing.
The irony of him being caught out, so to speak, with inappropriate relations, even though he's Minister of Relations or whatever his portfolio was. When I grow up, I want to be a politician. Then I can be a monumental hypocrite.
It's about time we had some honest politicians in the whole government. I think under Jacinda we're doing damn well, very well, and I'm quite happy with her performance. But some of the others might just need a little bit of a kick in the old.
Ian's worked extremely hard during his time as Palmerston North MP, so there'll be a lot of disappointed people today. But these things happen to all of us, not just members of Parliament. Who are real people, and sometimes people tend to forget that. So, all the best to Ian, and hopefully he can work through what he needs to work through and wish him well for whatever is next for him.
I do think that people in power should be really careful with the relationships they have, particularly with their staff. And overall I'm not happy about it, but it's politicking at its best in an election time. So I'm sad for Labour, for Palmerston North.
Locals feel let down and disappointed by the news. But what does it mean for the Labour stronghold? The electorate committee chair told RNZ the focus has now shifted to finding a new candidate ahead of the election. Other options for the city include Derek Ball from NZ First and 18-year-old national candidate William Wood. But the locals are unsure of what's going to happen over the next 2 months before the election.
I understand that the national replacement is 18 years old, so I'd be very surprised that anyone would want to elect an 18-year-old.
Well, this was a Labour stronghold. That's what we're talking about this morning around our coffee break. Palmerston North is actually a red city, so maybe other candidates have a good option now.
The election hoardings for Ian Lees-Galloway are still up for now. In Palmerston North for Checkpoint, Charlotte Cook.
A lot of feedback coming in on this issue. This listener says Falloon sent unsolicited pornographic images to multiple young women, and Jacinda passed the information on with no comment until after it was public. Lees-Galloway's had a consensual affair and Judith went to the media. False equivalency from the right-wing Twitterati and media again. Sue says, are any questions being asked about why someone thought it was appropriate to send information about Ian Lees-Galloway to Judith Collins? It would seem they wanted to stir things up and ignite a new scandal. And Graham from Whangarei has got in touch. Hi, Graham, and says, before everyone breathes a sigh of relief, Checkpoint might want to ask the AM show if Judith had primed them to ask the Patsy question in the first place. Let's be honest, Judith has a well-deserved reptile reputation. Thanks for getting in touch, Graham. It is 23 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. A controversial New Plymouth councillor says he will spearhead a citizens' initiated referendum against the formation of a Māori ward in the city if no one else steps up to the plate. Last night, the council voted 12-2 to bypass community consultation and establish a Māori ward in time for the next local body elections. Our Taranaki Whanganui reporter Robin Martin has more.
New Plymouth has history with Māori wards. In 2014, former Mayor Andrew Judd was spat at in the street when the council tried to introduce one under his watch. Mr Judd didn't stand for re-election after the Māori ward was thrown out in a citizens-initiated referendum in which 83% of those who took part voted against it. Now, Murray Chong, who voted against forming the ward last time, says he's willing to go down the same road.
I'm certainly going to seriously look at that and see if there's an appetite for a few people to help me with that, because I think someone needs to spearhead it. And for the true democracy of New Zealand, I think that's what we need to do, because obviously the people aren't being heard. We didn't even go to consultations.
Mr Chong is confident of getting the 4,000 signatures, or 5% of registered voters, required to overturn the decision.
That will actually prove, I think, based if it's similar to the last time, that'll prove that the majority of councillors are not listening to the people, and that's not a good look for our council. I think the views are still strongly opposed that, we need to treat everyone the same.
First-term councillor Sam Bennett moved the amendment that bypassed the community consultation process. He has no regrets.
I don't believe that the people in our community that are non-Maori should be making a decision on that. This is a decision purely for Maori, and that is why I did not support consultation. We know that if we go to the community for consultation, that it will get overturned by a binding poll.
Mr Bennett also has no qualms about Mr Chong spearheading a citizens-initiated referendum. Peter Moiahu is a former member of the council's iwi liaison committee and father of current councillor Dini Moiahu. He says another referendum may be just what's needed.
And if there is another reaction like there was 6 years ago, then we'll just face it. But here's the point. It's now an election year. And if this gets turned down by a citizens-initiated referendum, then I think the government has no option but to change the law, because it just shows that it's a racist piece of legislation.
The Mayor, Neil Holdham, abstained last night. Mr Holdham says he and his deputy, Richard Jordan, who voted against the formation of a ward, were not against a Maori ward per se, but upset at public consultation being circumvented.
So when I was asked to abandon that process and simply make a decision without giving the community an opportunity to speak, it was my view that I could not, in good conscience, support that. I don't think it was a good process.
The impending referendum also had him thinking about the failings in the legislation.
I think it highlights really that there is a piece of unjust legislation. Why do you only need half as many people to turn this decision of council over than you do for if we put in a geographic ward? And I think that's a question we should be asking all our political leaders.
On the streets of New Plymouth, there were varying views about the establishment of a Māori ward.
I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be a Māori ward.
Oh, look, they've got to have their say, so yeah, no, I'm fine with that.
I'm not happy about that. Not happy about that.
I think it's ultimately going to come sometime, and now's as good a time as any.
It's been a long time coming, and I'm really pleased about it finally.
They have every right, the same as anybody else that stands on the council, to get in there. So why have a separate one?
It's not very representative of people's feelings.
It's a bit overdue. It needed to come in.
Meanwhile, Peter Moiahu is quietly hoping community reaction to any referendum will be less incendiary than 6 years ago.
We've been at this game for generations. Hearing some naughty words doesn't kind of deter us. It's just a matter of our society and our nation evolving. So I don't have any major fears about where we're heading. I think it's good for our nation, and we'll see what the outcome is.
The local government minister, Nanaia Mahuta, today congratulated the New Plymouth Council on its decision to form a Māori ward. Ms Mahuta says there's merit in looking at whether the binding referendum process strikes the right balance between local democracy and representative participation. She says it hasn't been possible to progress reform this parliamentary term, but the government believes it's important to have Māori at the forefront of the decision-making process. I ngā mutu mo te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko Robin Martin-Aho.
All right, so time for more of your feedback before we head off this evening. This person on Ian Lees Galloway's sacking as minister and his decision not to stand again at the 2020 election says it is not becoming of a member of parliament and makes a mockery of honour, so therefore it should be a sackable offence. Our MPs elected by us should be accountable for their actions just like the rest of us would be. Julie's got in touch from Whangarei. She says it's obvious that Judith Collins revealed the information about Ian Lees Galloway in a tit-for-tat reprisal. That's the game she plays. Surely leaking confidential material, sending pornographic texts to young women are worthy of more opprobrium and publicity than an ill-advised affair that has ended. Another one in says, we take far too much pleasure in people's downfall. Sure, politicians need to be held to a high standard, but in the end, they are human like the rest of us. Lees Galloway has paid too high a price, while finger pointers conveniently avoid looking in the mirror. And Blanche from Kapiti says, the question which really needs to be asked is if Judith or any of her staff really hadn't shared anything around the information about Ian Lees Galloway, how did Duncan Garner know to ask the magic question? And Nick from Christchurch remembers when John Major in British politics was having an affair with Edwina Curry. He was working over there at the time and says they would be seen together in the halls of Whitehall, and they would have lost about 300 MPs if they sacked people for extramarital affairs.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters' accusations in Parliament, laying blame for leaking his superannuation details, have been roundly denied by those named. And Mr Peters has defended a trip to Antarctica for two wealthy women, saying they're fundraising for Scott Base. The Prime Minister says rumours of Ian Lees Galloway's affair with a former staff member didn't surface until yesterday. He's been fired from Cabinet. And doctors say fewer babies were born prematurely during the national lockdown, echoing reports from overseas. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7.
Tonight on Night, Simon Morris reviews Radioactive. It's a movie about Marie Curie. We've got a sequel to the excellent BBC series on Apollo 11. It's about Apollo 13, one that had a problem or two after leaving Houston. Doctors Nikki Fried and Olin Sullender discuss their work tracking the genome of COVID-19